Now let's move on. Sticking with commodities, gold prices have jumped nearly 20% since 2025 started, and the rally is spreading across other metal and basic resource commodities as U.S. President Trump slams higher tariffs on steel and aluminum, as well as automobile exports into the U.S. Simply put, the latest round of tariff wars ignited by President Donald Trump is reverberating across the global resource industry. Is it time then for Africa to rethink its resource agenda and strategy in response to what is beginning to look like a new era of resource nationalism? Welcome my guest tonight on the show, Bongo, a professor of economics at the Lagos Business School. A warm welcome to the show this holiday Tuesday, Professor. Good evening.
Good evening, boss, and thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. Thank you for making the time. What do you think the imperatives are, Professor, for Africa right now when it comes to resource nationalism, as President Trump is set to unleash a cocktail of trade tariffs tomorrow, the 2nd of April?
Well, yeah, that is something that has been in the mind and I think mouth of everyone who is interested in the future of Africa these days. There are two ways to look at it. So the first one is that, yeah, so we can see, just as you said, gold prices going up, commodities in general seem to be experiencing some kind of price spike in recent times. And I think that speaks to the perception of uncertainty in the global economy, and therefore people are taking, refuge in commodities, something like gold. So for most investors, that's kind of a safe haven to mitigate against future uncertainties, especially when people think that this new round of Trump tariff may trigger another wave of global recession. So, but again, so on the other hand, for Africans, it's a good opportunity, yeah, because we are commodity experts. This is an opportunity for us, to take advantage. But that is as far as it goes. Because if you consider the place of Africa when it comes to value chain, then you may wonder whether we can actually benefit from this, the perceived opportunity that you see. One thing that has happened in the global production system in recent times is the evolution of the production system, the morphing of production system into what I may call an oligopolistic market structure. So you see that every product or service that you may think of today is dominated by one known brand, global brand. And that is from sector to sector, across industries. So you have the dominance of some big multinational corporations who, to a very large extent, determine the state of affairs in every market. So it is their demand actually that drive the commodity markets all over the world. So given that as it is, then it is really difficult to see the influence or whatever leverage that Africa may have when it comes to determining their own fate when it comes to commodity prices, because the markets are already dominated and they have little domestic capacity for beneficiation or value augmentation of those commodities. So we only export most times unprocessed raw materials that are demanded by these big industrials that make use of them, augment them, and benefit largely from them. So Africa still remains, not part of the value chain, if you may put it in that strict sense.
Yeah, so Professor Adi, gold and other metal prices have been rallying. Gold touched another high today, $3,138 an ounce, 24%, really 27% upside for gold last year. This year is down about 20%. How should Africa position its trade diplomacy and negotiations under the present circumstances, or we just allow this good crisis to go to waste? Whether it is Ghana with gold, or gold in South Africa, or diamond in Botswana, or copper in Zambia and in Zimbabwe and elsewhere.
Yeah, so we can take the case of Nigeria's crude oil or even gas when it comes to value chain. I mean, let me go back to what I was saying, that we do not control the value chains. When you look at value chains, but again, I mentioned that production systems have morphed into oligopolistic market structure dominated by a few firms. Another thing that has happened within the global production network is the disaggregation of the production system into tasks. And those tasks take place in different countries. So each task is an incremental level which adds some value to that process. So most of these tasks take place in other parts of the world. None of them, very few of them take place in Africa. So what it means is this: if we are talking about copper, copper is not just used as copper. Copper is just an input to the production of so many other things. So the only way Africa features in the copper value chain is that Africa is the place where copper is mined. Now, the technology for the mining of copper, for example, is not indigenous to Africa. We still have to rely on global multinationals, on outsiders for the exploitation of our raw materials. Whether it is crude oil or gold or copper, we do not control the technology itself. So that means that we are dependent on the rest of the world for the exploitation of our own resources. Now, when it comes to its beneficiation, again, we are not part of it because they take it from here, they now go to somewhere in Europe or China or the United States or Americas, to augment them, add value to them, and then, convert them into final products or services that we buy. So we are the receiving end, either as exporters of the raw material or consumers of the final product. But when it comes to the value process, we are not there. Whether you're talking about pre-production or production itself or post-production, we don't find African countries there. So that is something that will tell us whether we stand any chance of benefiting from this opportunity. But I think what we can do is to look for how to domesticate some of these value chains within Africa. Already, we are lucky that in some years back, I think the United Nations Development, in partnership with their sister organization, UNCTAD, released a report that shows that there are about 75 value chains across different industries that could be domesticated fully in Africa. Meaning that, let's say if it is artemisinin, that grass or herb that you use in the production of malaria drug, that it can be produced, maybe farmed in one country, maybe Kenya, and then beneficiated in, say, Nigeria, and then consumed in other parts of Africa. So that is how to domesticate the value chain. Now, we have 75 opportunities, but I haven't heard anybody talking about this, how we can, leverage that opportunity to see how we can begin to add value to the raw materials that we have. So long as we depend on the outside market for the prices, for the demand, for the market of these raw materials, there is little that we can benefit from that. It doesn't matter what the price is.
Professor Adi, do you think that's the thinking behind the intra-Africa trade? As you said, if Ghana or if Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, the two largest cocoa producers in Africa, for example, will produce the cocoa, but the chocolate factory is in Senegal, in Sierra Leone, or in South Africa, or in Kenya, Tanzania, is that what you're saying, that could be us building the productivity base as we're watching what is likely going to become a full-blown trade war between some of the world's biggest economies, as we speak, China, US, Canada, the European Union, as it were. If you look at the G7, G20, that's roughly some of the biggest boys in the room.
You're saying we're saying the same thing, exactly what I'm saying. So we were here before. This is not the first time. So if you go back in history, the period after the Second World War in the 1960s, so there was that resurgence of global economic nationalism, what they could used to call beggar thy neighbor trade policies. Same thing that Trump is bringing back. In fact, if you understand the logic behind the formation of the European Union, was also to mount a trading bloc against the surge of Japanese and East Asian, exports in those days. So we've seen this before. So Trump is bringing it back. So I think this is the time for Africa to come together. Yeah, I like that value chain description that you gave with respect to cocoa, produced in Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire and then beneficiated in Senegal for re-export to other parts of Africa for consumption. So that is how we actually can control a value chain. And today, what is a market? Market is not just something out there in the open, because we have this misconception of talking about the liberal market, the open market, free market, as if it is just something out there falling from the skies that anybody can play in. No, there is no such thing. The market is actually a supply chain network dominated by someone who is a producer. So the producer of a commodity in a market is actually the owner of that market and is the one that controls that market. So the only way we can really dominate or control our fortunes when it comes to the raw materials or products that come from us is if we are able to domesticate the value chain locally. Now, I can give you a success story, which is Nigeria's LNG. Okay, so we do not just export the raw gas, but we have gotten to the stage where Nigeria can liquefy its natural gas and then export it to the rest of the world. And if my facts are true, sometimes Nigerian LNG does not have sufficient feedstock, to power its trends, that they have to actually import gas from other countries for liquefaction. So that tells you that, yeah, we are actually in the value chain there. And again, when you consider, for instance, the natural liquefied LNG market, see, Nigeria is, I think, the fifth largest exporter globally. So that is what it means to be in a value chain, to control the value chain. And again, so in terms of the value that can accrue to a country by ownership and dominance in the value chain, you again take the Nigerian LNG as an example, a very good example, because in the past couple of years, they have contributed more than $40 billion, close to $40 billion to Nigeria's coffers, either by way of dividends to the government's own share of that company or in tax revenue and royalties. So that is actually how you can use your own resource to really benefit your country. So if we are not able to replicate that experience in other sectors with other products, produces that we have, then there is no way that we can
surprisingly,
mount any sort of challenge.
Yeah, surprisingly, we haven't been able to do that with crude oil. That's a shame.
It's a very big shame, but but we are lucky that Dangote seems to have taken the bull by the horns, by setting up the largest refinery. Again, so today we can look at Nigeria as participating actively in the refining value chain. Okay, so that is the only value chain. So I've mentioned the only two value chains that we are active as Nigerians. One is LNG, the other one is refining via thanks to Dangote. So otherwise, there is no other value chain that we are active. And if we are not active in the value chains, it is not possible because the value is about money. That is where money is made. So we don't participate in pre-production. That is pre-production. We're talking about R&D, original ideas, where innovation takes place. I mean, that is the real value driver in the value chain. Then the least of it is manufacturing. We are not there. Manufacturing happens in China. So China dominates that segment of the value chain. And then the post-production, where you're talking about branding or marketing or consulting, again, all the big brands, when you talk about all those after-sales services, none of them is domestic to Africa. So we do not appear in the value chain, no matter the industry, no matter the sector, no matter the product or service that you focus on, except in LNG and refining. And I think that those are the lowest hanging fruit that we can use to build a strategy. Learning from a country such as Saudi Arabia, so some years back, they realized that they didn't have any sort of any foothold in the global value chain. And then they needed to go back home and re-strategize, recalibrate, and identified what was their competitive advantage, which was their oil and gas. And they put everything into it today. Saudi Aramco is one of the most valuable companies in the world and is driving the transformation that we have seen in the Saudi economy in the past decade. Nigeria has a chance of doing that, but why we haven't taken it seriously, why we haven't declared a state of emergency, in oil and gas, is still something that before those understand.
So Professor Adi, you're touching on the nerve of what you call productivity. Here, we are not yet productive as a continent, in a manner of speaking, to be able to sit at a table where the big deals have been discussed with those big corporations you're talking about, whether it's ExxonMobil on one hand, or Total Energies, or ArcelorMittal, and the rest, Anglo American and the rest. So does it make sense to you, therefore, that the International Monetary Fund Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, just late last week announced that the IMF has a new advisory council on entrepreneurship and growth as the IMF laments the declining level of productivity globally. What's your take on that? Do you think that's in good direction?
Well, yeah, so it's good to encourage entrepreneurship because when you talk about productivity happens at the level of firms. Firms are owned by entrepreneurs, yeah? So there is no other way to raise productivity of the world, or of countries, of nations, except by interacting and engaging with entrepreneurs who are people who are really schooled, disciplined in the art of bringing new services and new goods into the market. Okay, so that is the only way we can do that. I think IMF seems to be doing the right thing. Rather than armchair theoretical speculations, they now have to engage with people who are active in the field to learn from them what really makes them tick. And I'm happy that somebody like Tony Elumelu, one of our own, is included in that very high-level team of advisors to the IMF president. So, yeah, it's a step in the right direction. Yeah, but locally here in Nigeria, I think sometime last year, even Tony Elumelu, I guess, was one of the members of that team set up by the president, the current president. We have Tony Elumelu, all the big industrialists, even Dangote, they were there. But I've not heard anything from them since they were inaugurated. I haven't seen what policies or what innovations the government has come up with to boost productivity or to build entrepreneurship skills within the country. So we're yet waiting for them to respond.
So you mentioned Tony Elumelu there, and of course he's joining 8 other IMF Advisory Council members, which were selected by the IMF globally speaking. But again, when you talk about entrepreneurship and where the nexus is with growth, so if the IMF could recognize that they need this private sector, folks in academia, those who are doing a whole lot on the ground on entrepreneurship, like Tony Elumelu Foundation and the rest from around the world, coming together to provide some inputs, advisory into what the IMF research and data would work with to develop certain ideas and write policies, advisory to developing countries. How important is this for us? And you're just touching on this type of council that we've had in Nigeria, advisory council, not even to the current president alone, but the immediate past president as well in terms of economic advisory council. But like you said, not much in the needle, nothing has moved, significantly speaking. So what do you think the problem really is, or could be?
Well, I really don't know, but when it comes to external advisory, to African government, most people have become very skeptical to the influence of such, supranational organizations on national economic performance. Let's go to the United States. You could see that none of those countries, none of the advanced nations, rely on IMF. So for me, IMF and the World Bank Yeah, thankfully they do a lot of good work. There is no doubt about that. But they are kind of colonial institutions because we're still steeped in the colonial mindset that maybe these countries have no ability to do anything for themselves. But if you see what Trump has done, you may not be very comfortable with some of his policies. You may not like what he's done largely. But the fact is that it has changed a whole lot of things in the United States. I was reading the news the other day. Yeah, a lot of people are against Trump, but then his policies seem to be turning things in favor of the United States. A lot of foreign investment, foreign direct investment are flowing into the United States even as we speak. Major corporations, in order to evade the tariffs, are now setting up plants in the United States. Beyond that, let's not forget, during the first tenure of Trump was the one that turned the United States economy around from being a net oil importer to a net oil and gas exporter. Today, before, it used to be, I think, Australia, the largest exporter of LNG. Now, America seems to be taking over that. So before that, America doesn't have as much gas reserve as Qatar, which is number one. But when it comes to the export of LNG, America has emerged to be one. And then don't forget that the first LNG vessel shipped in the United States in 2016, that was during Trump's first tenure. And now he's ramping up that. So you could see that when it comes to national development agenda transformation, it is not something that has to be willed from the outside. It's something that people have to really come together to think about. So nobody can think for Nigeria. I think maybe because it hasn't hurt us enough. Because last week when I was discussing with some of my students on this value chain thing, and then it came to, so we observed that Nigeria is not visible in any value chain. In fact, no African country is visible in any dominant value chain in the world today. So they started asking, what is the future? What does the future hold for us? I couldn't answer those questions. But I gave them an instance that, okay, so for some countries in Africa, such as Botswana, they've managed somehow to beneficiate their God-given, their endowed natural resources, the diamond. So the production and the management seem to happen there. And that has really transformed that economy. Okay, so we also go to other countries, such as Rwanda. We've seen what has happened in Rwanda in very recent times. Okay, so some of these countries are trying to domesticate their capacity, to beneficiate, to augment the value of their natural endowment, rather than just being exporters of raw materials. Because that is the only thing that is left for Africa today. We cannot compete with the Chinese when it comes to manufacturing. We cannot compete with the rest of the world when it comes to, high tech. So what we have are those natural endowments. And for us to really transform our system, we really need to think of how, a new strategy to begin to beneficiate what we have locally. We don't need IMF. We don't need external influences as such. I don't think there's any kind of brain, any kind of intellectual capacity that is lacking in Nigeria.
Okay, so we don't really need much of that. We can just take a look at all the paperwork and all that. So Nigerian President Bola Ahmed Tinubu last week signed off on the 2 final regional development commissions for South, South, and Southwest. What do you make of this approach to national development, setting up national development commissions like the NDDC and the rest?
Listen, that's so frustrating because I thought that this president would be on something different. But unfortunately, we are seeing the recycling of old ideas that have never worked. So you don't continue on the same trajectory when you haven't really, when it hasn't benefited you in one way or the other. So what's the role of the states? What's the role of the municipalities? What's the role of local governments? So when you have to keep multiplying, replicating institutions, there is this thing we say in philosophy, Occam's razor, named after William of Ockham, that ends should not be multiplied beyond necessity. Why do we need to be replicating systems that have never worked? We have NDDC. What has NDDC achieved that the state government cannot achieve? So why do we have the state government? And then people are still pushing for the creation of more states, creation of more local governments. And then the president is still creating regional development, whatever. What is the role of the subnational entities? Rather than replicating and duplicating functions and institutions, I think what we really need, what is imperative, is to set up effective systems of accountability and transparency, so that people can really have an input to how the system is run, how their resources are utilized. That is what we need. We don't need new institutions. We are overburdening the system with irrelevant and ineffective institutions. I don't think it's a step in the right direction.
Okay, so just to put it together, Professor Adi, what new thinking would you like to see being onboarded? You talked about getting the subnationals. Folks believe that development will have to happen at the local and the state level. So how do you think we can fast-track that from the current structure, federally speaking, that we currently run? Because it looks like whoever is the president does not really have a hold on those 36 state governors. They just do whatever they like. They got a fund. They don't have to ask for it. We just give it to them. And we don't ask them what they do with it, because there's no way of saying, hey, can we have an account of how much you spend? There's no mechanism for all of that. So we're a loser. We're a goner, isn't it? What needs to change?
Yeah, so you see, when you have, when you have a system that relies solely on the benevolence of the leader, then you just don't have any system, right? The states that work in Nigeria today, whether it is Abia State, because a lot of references have been made to how the governor of Abia State is doing well in the state. Same thing is beginning to come up from Anambra State, where Professor Soludo is holding sway. So these two individuals seem to be driving transformation in their states. Well, the same can also be said to a certain extent in Lagos, with road infrastructure and all of that. So we have some of these states where, depending on the benevolence of the governors, we could see some change. But then no system is sustainable if it is run on idiosyncratic systems. So we need to institutionalize this. So the system of governance that we have is flawed. That's been talking about that is about flogging a dead horse. Everybody knows about the weaknesses in our constitution, but our governance system, and then people are pointing also to the deficiencies of the democratic system that we have in Nigeria. For some people, it is no longer democracy the way it is. So, but this is not the right forum nor the time to begin to talk about those things. So a lot of things need to fundamentally change. Now, when the president came on board, we thought that it was going to go that direction, especially when you come in from his manifesto. So there was that commitment that they were going to push through the Orasanyo report, which was about downsizing and rationalizing the public system and introducing some level of accountability and transparency in the system. We thought that would happen and that he was going to take it even to the subnational level, but that hasn't happened at all. Instead, we are seeing the replication on the reenactment of the old thing. It's not going to take us anywhere. So there's no point pontificating on all these matters. We know the solutions. They are not that difficult. It requires the political will to really do that. Today, Nigeria is overwhelmed by insecurity everywhere. So, where do I start? And all of these things boil down to the failure of the system of governance that we have in place.
All right, that's quite an incisive conversation with you here tonight, Professor Bongo Adi of the Lagos Business School. Thank you so much. It's a holiday evening, and we thank you as always for your time on the RIS Exchange. Enjoy the rest of your evening.